Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy, Sports and Fitness Rants? I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. Got another great video for you guys today. As usual, you guys know the deal on this channel, man. We must continue to set the record straight. Stop the lies. Stop the narratives. Stop them from rewriting the history, y'all. You guys know the deal on this channel, man. And in this video, we're going to talk about something I mentioned the other day in one of the videos I did when I talked about specialists, right? How players from the 80s and the 90s, like the era that I grew up watching, there were specialists, guys that were known for certain things, right? That's what they did, right? I'm going to highlight some players in this video, and I'm going to try to, really highlight, like I said, what I mean when I'm talking about specialists of that era, guys. And I want to thank you guys, man. Everyone across the world, everyone across the states has been supporting my channel. Thank you to everyone out there, man. I'm truly, truly humble, guys, by all the support, man. Shout out to everybody in the membership. For real, guys, it means a lot, man. I am truly, like I said, truly, truly humble, guys, by all support, man. Much respect to everybody out there, the true basketball fans that are standing up, guys. Thank you. And you guys know what to do. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So, yes, guys, like I said, man, shout out to my man, Uncommon Sense, man. Shout out to him. I was listening to a video that he did the other day, and he had shouted me out in the video, talking about how I mentioned specialists in one of the videos I did the other day, and he had talked about these things on his channel before in the past. And specialists, guys, what do we mean by quote-unquote specialists? As it pertains to the guys that I grew up watching in the 80s and the 90s, I want you to go over and highlight some players just so you guys can see, like as an example of what I mean by specialists. All right, because when I'm talking about specialists in the 80s and the 90s, and I'm talking to you guys about how the game was more balanced, right? Because there were some guys who there were specialists in the NBA, right? Guys had certain skills, right? And this is the way that they approached the game, right? They focused on this aspect, whatever that aspect was. And I broke this down into a couple of categories. I broke this down into 3-point / shooting, right? 3-point shooting / just shooters in general, guys who are known for just being knockdown shooters. Like, they're in the game. You can't leave these guys open, right? That was their specialty. They were known for being just knockdown shooters, 3-point shooters, right? That was one category. Another category that I broke it down into is the high flyers. The guys who were known for just being like those athletic guys, the high flyers. These guys, what their specialty was their athleticism, right? Maybe they didn't develop an overall game, right? They weren't focused on, let's say, scoring or other aspects. They used their athleticism. These guys were high flyers. They used to get up and down the court, right? Catch the alley-oop dunks. They would make plays using their athleticism, right? That was their specialty. They were specialized in that, right? And then I also broke it down into a third category, which is a combination of a couple of things, right? I broke it down between defensive players, defensive specialists, guys who were hustle guys, and guys that were enforcers, right? Because for me, those categories kind of go hand in hand, right? Enforcers, defensive guys, and those hustle guys, right? Those guys that had the grit, the heart, the hustle guys, right? To me, like that, those three kind of go hand in hand, especially when we're talking about the 80s and 90s. So like I said, guys, we're talking about specialists, right? And some of these guys that I'm going to mention, these are not Hall of Fame players. And for the most part, they're not even like perennial all-stars, these guys. They're specialists. Like I said, when they came in the game, they had a certain job and they focused on that job. That was their role on the team. And this is why I usually tell you guys, back in the 80s and the 90s, like I said, the era that I grew up watching, we talk about teams, right? They were great teams because they were, right? They were well-balanced teams, right? These teams were 6, 7, 8, 9 men deep, a lot of these teams in these eras, right? They could go to the bench and bring guys off the bench that had specialties. They specialized in something, whether they came in and played defense and they hustled. Maybe they were an enforcer, right? Maybe they were a shooter, right? They came in and boom, they would come in. You can't leave these guys open, right? Or maybe, like I said, they had the athletics ability, right? They came in, they were a high flyer. They used their athleticism to their advantage, right? They had athleticism edge over other players. That was their specialty. They specialized in that aspect of the game, all right? So let's think about some of these players now. Like I said, guys, I wrote some of these players down, just guys that I thought of off the top of my head, man, that I remember and how I remember them, their specialty to me. All right, we're going to start with the 3-point shooters, / like I said, just shooters in general. Like the jump. Back in the 80s and 90s, guys, when I was going and watching the NBA, right? More specifically, even the 90s. three-point shooting wasn't this prevalent, right? So guys weren't taking 10, 15, 20 threes a game, right? If you took a lot of threes, that meant you take maybe 3, 4, 5 threes in a game. That was a lot of three-point attempts for somebody back in them days, right? So, when we talk about being a shooter, it wasn't about, a differentiation between a three-point shooter and a shooter. Like now you'll say, oh, these guys are three-point shooters. Back in the day, if you were a shooter, that was your specialty. It was because if you were left open, you were knocking it down. It didn't matter if it was a perimeter jump shot, a long two, or if it was a actual three-point shot, right? So we start with this group of guys. We think about Dana Barros. I don't know if you guys remember Dana Barros, right? Played in the 90s, right? Dana Barros, a guy who could get hot from the outside, right? He was a knockdown three-point shooter. He was a knockdown shooter in general. Dana Barros, right? He's only about, 6'1", maybe 6'2", somewhere around there. Like I said, a guy in this, if he played in this era, man, he would be even more sensational. But Dana Barros, a guy that could come in, like I said, that was his specialty, man. He was a straight up shooter, man, just knocking down the jumpers, man. Like I said, one of the early guys in the 90s, man, that would knock down the threes, that would shoot the threes, that would utilize the three-point shot to a degree that you didn't really see that much in the 90s. So shout out to Dana Barros. I actually believe that Dana Barros almost had a 50-40-90 season, I believe in the 1994 season, I want to say, or the 95 season, one of those years, I believe he almost had a 50-40-90 season. He had over 50% from the field, over 40% from three, but I believe he shot 89.9% from the free throw line that season. So he was like a couple free throws shy of qualifying for the 50-40-90. Like I said, guys back in them days, they weren't aiming for these things. So shout out to Dana Barros. Another guy, Craig Hodges, right? Was a specialist. These guys are specialists, man. Craig Hodges. You can't leave Craig Hodges open. Once again, a knockdown shooter. I believe Craig Hodges won three-point contests in a row after Larry Bird won 3 in a row. So shout out to Craig Hodges, won a couple of championships with the Chicago Bulls in 91 and 92, but a knockdown shooter, man. Craig Hodges coming there, and if you leave him open, man, he's knocking it down, man. Could get hot from the three. That was his thing, man. Craig Hodges, like I said, another specialty. Trent Tucker, another guy from the 80s and the 90s, man, that was just a flat-out shooter, could knock it down. Trent Tucker, man, played for the New York Knicks, played for several teams. Played for the New York Knicks for a couple of years. I believe he might have played for the Chicago Bulls for a couple seasons. But once again, Trent Tucker, a knockdown shooter, man. Like I said, just a guy who could just flat-out shoot the three ball. Like I said, just these guys are specialists, man. This was their specialty. Dale Ellis, another guy, Dale Ellis, man. Once again, a knockdown shooter. Dale Ellis in this era, man. Dale Ellis would be sensational coming off the screens. Like I said, moving out the basketball, catch and shoot. Dale Ellis, man. Like I said, the guy who could just flat out score. Some of these guys were scorers because they were just shooters, man. Dale Ellis could come in and drop 20, 30 points on you, man. So shout out to Dale Ellis, man. Another guy who was just, like I said, just a wet jumper, man. The quick release of a Dale Ellis. Another guy, specialty, just knocking down the jumper. Dale Ellis. 3D, Dennis Scott, who played for the Orlando Magic. You guys remember them years he played for Orlando Magic when they went to the Eastern Conference Finals. He was on the Orlando Magic when they went to the NBA Finals. All throughout those 90s, played, I believe, from like 1991 to like 1997 on the Orlando Magic. But 3D, one of the first high-volume three-point shooters in the NBA, man. In the history of the NBA, like I said, this guy was one of the first guys to really go out there and shoot a lot of three-pointers in a game, man. And that was his specialty, man. Like I said, Dennis Scott's in the game, man. You can't leave this man open. Get a hand up, man, right? Hand down, man down. With all of these guys I'm talking about, this is their specialty. They were specialists, man. So 3D, Dennis Scott. Chuck Person, the rifleman, another man you can't leave open, specialist, man. You leave this man open and he's going to be wet on you. This guy can catch fire. That's why his nickname is the rifleman, because the man was just gunning away. Chuck Person, man, a gunner, played with Reggie Miller on the Indiana Pacers for many seasons. I believe he was the rookie of the year before Reggie Miller came into the NBA. So shout out to Chuck Person, like I said, the rifleman who would just be out there gunning, man, could fill it up, just a flat-out shooter. These guys are just specialists, man. This is what they did, man. They just shot the ball, man. You couldn't leave these guys open. When they checked into the game, you had to make sure you knew where they were. Steve Kerr. You guys remember Steve Kerr, the Chicago Bulls, the Cleveland Cavaliers. Who else? He played for a couple of teams, the San Antonio Spurs. Played for several teams in the NBA. Obviously, he's known for his time on the Chicago Bulls in the second three-peat. But Steve Kerr, once again, a specialist, a knockdown shooter, right? That was Steve Kerr. That was his job out there. That was his role on the basketball court, to go out there and make open jump shots, right? Like when Michael Jordan passed him the ball in 97, to knock down an open jump shot. That was Steve Kerr's specialty. He was a specialist, man. Can't leave Steve Kerr open, man. He's a knockdown shooter. Shout out to Steve Kerr. Tim Legler, another guy who played in the 90s. Shout out to Tim Legler. You guys probably know him as an analyst on ESPN. He's actually a pretty decent analyst, but shout out to Tim Legler, another knockdown shooter. Played about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years in the 90s. But shout out to Tim Legler, another guy that was just, like I said, flat out shooter. So that was his specialty, to come in and knock down some threes, man. So shout out to Tim Legler. Jeff Hornacek, another guy that could come in the game and knock down the jump shot with the smooth stroke. Jeff Hornacek, you guys know him probably from the Utah Jazz, battling against the Chicago Bulls, but he also played many years for the Phoenix Suns. So shout out to Jeff Hornacek, another guy you didn't want to leave open out there on the court. The man was just money, just a flat-out shooter, man. So shout out to Jeff Hornacek. Hersey Hawkins, another guy, man, that could just flat out shoot the ball. Hersey Hawkins, another specialist out there that could shoot it, man. Shout out to Hersey Hawkins, man. The dude played with a lot of heart, played with a lot of grit, man. So shout out to Hersey Hawkins, battling Michael Jordan many years on those Philadelphia 76ers teams in 1990. And I believe in 1991, they played the Bulls in the playoffs. Shout out to Hersey Hawkins. Del Curry, another specialist, another three-point specialist, another knockdown shooter. Obviously, know Del Curry, the father of Steph Curry. But Del Curry was a knockdown shooter. Not like Steph Curry. He was more of a spot-up shooter, a catch-and-shoot shooter. He wasn't going to break you down off the dribble like Steph Curry did, like Steph Curry can. But Del Curry was a knockdown shooter, man. So shout out to Del Curry, man. Like I said, one of the great specialists of that era. Sam Perkins, another specialist, another knockdown shooter for a big man, about 6'10", 6'11". Sam Perkins, big smooth, could step out there, stretch forward, could knock the three down. So shout out to Sam Perkins, man. Like I said, another specialist coming there, can't leave Sam Perkins open. And Danny Ainge, man, another guy that I put down on here, another guy, like I said, who was just a guy specialist, man. You didn't want to leave Danny Ainge open, man, because he was money out there. Now, with some of these guys that I mentioned, guys, they were also 3 and kind of D guys, 3 and D. Like, you hear a lot of that term now, 3 and D. Some of these guys that I mentioned in this list were also 3 and D guys. They didn't necessarily call them 3 and D guys back in them days. Like I said, their specialty was to be knockdown shooters. But some of these guys also played defense out there well, right? That was part of their specialty, to knock down shots and to be a hustle guy on the defensive end, right? These guys are not going to be all great defensive players or all team defensive players, but they're going to be hustle guys. Guys like Craig Hodges was a 3 and D guy. Dennis Scott was a 3 and D player. Who else? Hersey Hawkins was a 3 and D guy. Jeff Hornacek was a 3 and D guy. Danny Ainge was a 3 and D guy. All of these guys, man, they played both ends. They hustled on both ends, but their specialty was to come in and knock down shots. Right? That was the specialist, guys. Now let's move into the high flyers, guys, all right? The high flyer list, I think I just wrote these guys off the top of my head, guys that I remembered using their athleticism, right, to the advantage, right, so that they could make highlight plays. And this is what you knew them for. Like I said, none of these guys are Hall of Famers or perennial all-star players, but they were still very solid veterans and professionals out there in the 80s and the 90s. Like I said, and these guys used their athleticism to their advantage. That was their specialty, man. This is what they were known for, coming in the game, dunking the ball, like I said, getting out in the break, getting in the passing lanes, creating steals, you know what I'm saying, catching alley-oops. This is what it is, guys. We think about guys like Kenny Skywalker, man, who won a slam dunk contest. Kenny Skywalker played for the New York Knicks for some years. This guy was known for being a high flyer, right? He didn't have a bunch of other skills. Like, he wasn't, like I said, he'd be this all well-rounded offensive threat. But when he was out there on the court, that's what he was there to do, man. Get up and down the court, hustle on the court, and be a high flyer. Use his athleticism, like I said, to get on the break. So like I said, take it to the rim hard on play, draw contact, draw fouls against big men. This was Kenny to Skywalker, man. So shout out to him, one of the high flyers of the 80s and the 90s. Harold Miner, who played some years in the NBA. I believe he played about 4 or 5 seasons in the NBA in the 90s. He was quite the first, like, Baby Jordan. They were calling him Baby Jordan because of the dunks that he was doing in the slam dunk contest in the early 90s. Shout out to Harold Miner. He was known for being a high flyer, right? He wasn't a well-rounded offensive player, but on the offensive end, he's going to catch alley-oops. He's going to run the floor. Like I said, he's going to get your big man in trouble sometimes because he's going to attack the paint, and he's going to finish hard, man. So shout out to Harold Miner, another guy who's a high flyer. Stacey Augmon, another guy wrote down here, Stacey Augmon, the Plastic Man. This is why he was called the Plastic Man, because Stacey Augmon would be out there on the break. He can catch alley-oops. He had the long arms. He had the long, lanky body, the athletic body of Stacey Augmon. Like I said, just a great athlete from the 90s era NBA. Like I said, this guy, that was his specialty, man, to be out there in the passing lanes, on the break. So shout out to Stacey Augmon, another high flyer from the 90s. Kendall Gill. You guys know Kendall Gill, another athletic wing from the 1990s era NBA. Kendall Gill, man, a high flyer, a guy who would create many steals on the court using his athleticism to his advantage. So shout out to Kendall Gilman. Like I said, another specialist, a high flyer, athletic wing, you know what I'm saying, that could get things done on the court. He could create havoc with his athleticism. I believe he might have the record for most steals in a single game. So shout out to Kendall Gill. Jerome Kersey, another high fly. Jerome Kersey played for the Portland Trailblazers for many years. You guys remember he was on that 92 Trailblazer team that went to the NBA Finals against the Chicago Bulls. Jerome Kersey, a small forward, man. Like I said, powerfully built. This guy was a power dunker, man. Jerome Kersey, man, in the slam dunk contest several seasons. Like I said, was a high flyer, man. Guy who played with an attitude, played with a lot of heart and a lot of grit, man. So shout out to Jerome Kersey, man. Like I said, one of the high flyers of the 90s era, the 80s, 90s era of NBA, man. Shout out to Jerome Kersey. Cedric Ceballos, another guy. You guys know Cedric Ceballos, who won the slam dunk contest, right, with the blindfold on. Shout out to Cedric Ceballos, a high flyer of the 90s era NBA. Another guy, like I said, didn't have like the well-rounded overall offensive game where he's going to, be scoring all these points and things like that. But these guys use their athleticism on the court. So someone like a Cedric Ceballos is going to be out there taking it to the hole. And like I said, he's a high flyer, 6'7". Cedric Ceballos, you guys remember him from the Phoenix Suns all those years. Also, another guy, Chris Morris. I don't know if you guys remember Chris Morris. He started out his career as a high flyer. In the later part of his career, he became more of a spot-up three-point shooter, Chris Morris. Especially, I believe, when he played for the Utah Jazz back in 96, I believe in 97. I believe he played for Utah Jazz. He was on that one Jazz team, I believe, that went to the NBA Finals. And I believe they traded him in 98. But Chris Morris, when he first came in the league with the New Jersey Nets, Chris Morris was a high flyer, man. About 6'8", 6'9", small forward. This dude, like I said, he could get up and down the court, get the long arms, the athletic body. So shout out to Chris Morris, another high flyer. Who else I wrote down here? D Brown. You guys remember D Brown, right? Only about 6'1". D Brown, another guy who won a slam dunk contest, right? With the cover in the eyes dunk. Shout out to D Brown, another high flyer from the 90s. This is their specialty. These guys, this is their specialty, man. They were specialists, man. They used their athleticism, their high-flying ability to impact games, man, to create havoc on the court, whether it was on the defensive end, like I told you, like a Kendall Gill, who could create steals with athleticism. They specialized in their high-flying ability, their athleticism. And Richard Dumas. I wrote down Richard Dumas, man. He only played a couple of years in the NBA. And we all know he had the drug problems. But shout out to Richard Dumas, man. He was a high flyer, man. He could have really been something, man. He had the potential, Richard Dumas. He was on that 93 Phoenix Suns team that went to the NBA Finals. But Richard Dumas, man, one of the high flyers of the 90s era of NBA. And we think about some of the defensive guys now. Now, remember, guys, we talk about specialists. This is not to say that these players didn't do other things good or impact the game in other areas, but this was their specialty. This is what they were known for. This is what they brought to the table. This was their mindset approach, their approach to the game coming in here, right? This is what they focused on. They didn't try to do other things. They didn't try to play outside of themselves. This is why teams were successful, and this is why a lot of these teams were great teams, because the guys played their roles. They accepted their roles, right? And they succeeded in those roles because they specialized in those roles. Now let's move to the defensive guys. I wrote down P.J. Brown. Once again, P.J. Brown, another defensive member. Now remember, guys, this is a combination of defensive guys. They're specialists on the defensive end. They're known for their defense, their hustle, or they're an enforcer, right? Some of these guys are all three. P.J. Brown, he was an enforcer. He was known for his defensive skills, right? And he was a gritty hustle guy, man. Everyone could use a P.J. Brown on their team, man. P.J. Brown ain't playing no games. You remember him from the rivalries with the New York Knicks. P.J. Brown was always in there. So shout out to P.J. Brown, man. Charles Oakley, you all know Charles Oakley. Of course, we had to mention Oak, man, the Oak. Charles Oakley, one of the great enforcers, one of the great solid defensive players of the 90s, and one of the the grittiest and hustle guys of the 90s, man. When you think about hustle, you think about, like I said, just heart, grit, enforcers. You think about Charles Oakley when you think about the 90s, man, the 80s and the 90s, man. So shout out to Charles Oakley. Otis Thorpe, another guy from the 80s and the 90s, man, played with Hakeem Olajuwon on the Houston Rockets for a lot of years, man. Otis Thorpe, man, one of the most durable, toughest, and grittiest basketball players of that era, man. Shout out to Otis Thorpe. Never gets mentioned much because, he played with Hakeem Olajuwon. But shout out to Otis Thorpe, man. He was the power forward there right next to Hakeem for many, many years. Always playing 82 games. Like I said, this dude was just gritty, known for his defensive prowess, his rebounding, his tenacity. Shout out to him, man, for real. Anthony Mason, once again, another enforcer, another hard hustle, grit guy known for his defensive specialty, his defensive prowess. This is their specialty, guys. This is what these guys specialized in, man. When these guys were in the game, This is what they were going to bring to the table. So shout out to Anthony Mason, man. You guys know about Anthony Mason. Joe Wilkins. I want to shout out to Joe Wilkins, man. The Jordan stopper. You guys remember Joe Wilkins played for the New York Knicks, the Cleveland Cavaliers for many seasons. Remember, he was the guy guarding Michael Jordan a lot of years. He would match up against Michael Jordan. He would study film on Michael Jordan. Remember, he said that he felt that he guarded Michael Jordan better than anybody in the league. And what was that, the 1990... I want to say that was 1993 season. He said that before the Bulls played them in the second round. But Joe Wilkins, he was known for his defensive ability, man, for being a hard, gritty and hustle guy, man. That was his specialty, man. Playing defense, like I said, being out there hustling and then getting out in the break, you know what I'm saying? And like I said, using some of his athleticism. But he was known for being a defensive specialist, man. So shout out to Joe Wilkins. Doug Christie, another guy from that 90s into that 2000s. Doug Christie. Shout out to Doug Christie, man. Played in the 90s some years. Was known for a defensive specialty, just a defensive specialist. Shout out to Doug Christie. He played for the Sacramento Kings teams, if you remember, in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, going against those Lakers squads. But in the 90s, he also played, guys. I remember Michael Jordan going against him when he was on the Toronto Raptors in those late 90s. So shout out to Doug Christie, another guy who was known for his defensive abilities. Rick Mahorn. Rick Mahorn, you think about enforcers from that 80s into the 90s. You think about Rick Mahorn of the Washington Bullets from those early 80s teams, man. I tell you, those tough, gritty Washington Bullets teams with Jeff Rulin, like I said, and Rick Mahorn, Jeff Malone, some of these guys, man. So shout out to Rick Mahorn, one of the enforcers of that 80s, 90s era, was on the Detroit Pistons, I believe in the 1989 team. I believe he was on the Detroit Pistons in the 89 team. But Rick Mahorn, man, McNasty, that was his nickname. Like I said, an enforcer, a defensive specialist, a hard hustle guy. So shout out to Rick Mahorn, man. Once again, another specialist. Kevin Willis. Shout out to Kevin Willis, another guy like an Otis Thorpe. Played for the Atlanta Hawks for many, many seasons. One of the most durable, like I said, toughest, grittiest basketball players of all time. Always played 82 games, was always available, was always there, Kevin Willis. Known for his defensive abilities, his rebounding prowess. This is Kevin Willis. He got the heart, the grit. He's out there hustling. This is Kevin Willis, man. So shout out to Kevin Willis. Like I said, played many years on the Atlanta Hawks. Played with Dominique Wilkins. So shout out to Kevin Willis, man. Like I said, one of the great defensive specialists and rebounding guys of that 90s era. John Starks, another specialist, man. John Starks, we all know, played for the New York Knicks for many seasons, was known for being a gritty, hustle guy for the New York Knicks, just going out there working, like I said, a blue-collar player. But that's what his thing. He was a specialist. That was his specialty, man, to play on the defensive end, be a gritty player, a hard-nosed player, give the effort. That was John Starks, man. So shout out to John Starks. Another guy, Vernon Maxwell. We wanted to mention Vernon Maxwell, another specialist from the 80s and the 90s. Vernon Maxwell, who was a hard-nosed defensive player. That's what he was known for, man. Going out there and giving the max effort on the defensive, man. Mad Max, man. Playing with a lot of heart, a lot of grit, a lot of intensity. So this man was out there hustling, and he was known for that. That was his specialty. So, guys, these are the guys that I mentioned, man. I know the video's gone kind of long, but this is what I'm trying to always highlight or allude to when I'm talking about specialists. All of these guys that I mentioned, none of them are Hall of Famers. None of them are perennial all-star players. Some of them are very good players. Some of them are good players. Some of them are starters. Some of them weren't starters. Some of them were starters, and then they became role players. Some of them started off as role players and bench players, and then became stars, and then went back to role players. But the main thing with all these players that we must remember was their approach to the game. Right? Because they had a role, a defined role, because they specialized in something, they were not worried about doing other things outside of their role, outside of their specialty, what they were really good at, right? They allowed that to be their main focus, to help a team, to be a key member of a team. That's how teams developed in the 80s and the 90s. You had guys who played roles, right? And role players were respected. All of a sudden, over the last 10, 15 years, role players have been something like, it's disrespectful now to be a role player. When I was growing up, to be a role player and to play your role, to be a quality role player, that mattered. You got respect. That was a respected position in the NBA. And these guys that I mentioned, whether they were three-point specialists or shooters, whether they were the high flyer guys that use their athleticism to get around the court and hustle and make plays that way, or they were the defensive hard-nosed hustle guys, right, the glue grit guys, or they were the enforcers. All of these guys filled a role, and they specialized in that role, which allowed them to be successful in that role. They didn't worry about maybe being a rebounder when they were shooters. No, they focused on what they were good at. They specialized in that. And that's what made them successful at that. Like I said, no, these guys were not going to be Hall of Famers and perennial All-Stars. That's not what it was about. It was about the era of the 80s and the 90s. That's what made it so well-rounded and balanced. Guys accepted roles and guys were able to specialize in certain aspects. Were there other three-point shooters in the NBA? Absolutely. They were all-time great three-point shooters. But those guys did not specialize in three-point shooting. They were great at that aspect as well as other aspects, like Reggie Miller, right? He didn't just specialize in three-point shooting. He did other things on the basketball court, right? He was a leader out there. He's a superstar player of his era. He didn't specialize. Michael Jordan, Clyde Drexler, Dominique Wilkins, all these guys are high flyers. Absolutely, but they did not specialize. That was not all they utilized was their high-flying ability. They had well-rounded games. They did other things on the court, right? They focused on other eras. These guys just focused on that specialty. That's what they were known for. That's where they excelled. Right? Were they great defensive players in the 80s and 90s? Absolutely. You had the Dikembe Mutombos and the Dennis Rodmans, the Scottie Pippens, but that was not just where they specialized in that one avenue. Dennis Rodman specialized in defense and rebounding to a degree that was unmatched by a lot of these guys, these lesser guys that just specialized in just that one avenue of maybe being a hustle guy who played defense and gave effort. Right? Dennis Rodman was a special exception, right? For his rebounding ability, his prowess, and his defensive abilities. Right? Not many people can match what he did in those regards. So, guys, shout out to everybody who played in the 80s and the 90s. Shout out to these guys I mentioned, the specialists of that era. These were just some guys that I off the top of my head. Maybe you guys can think of some other players. But once again, shout out to that era. Shout out to all those guys, man. You guys know the deal, man. I'll catch you guys on the next one.